Hello everybody. A very warm welcome to our today's Terrestrial University Observing, Participating and Commenting, our experimental lecture series in the framework of the exhibition Critical Zones, Observatories for Earthly Politics, currently at the ZKM. It is the edition number 18, and my name is Jessica. I'll be the host for the talk tonight. In the Telegram group, we have my dear colleague Tatjana, who is taking care of your questions. So if you have anything you want to know about our speakers and their projects, do not hesitate to post everything into the chat, and we will make sure to forward it to the speakers. So welcome to Sam Skinner and Mirko Nikolić, who are our guests of today's evening. And the topic or the question that we will deal with is, what could an artist-led observatory or observation in the 21st century be like? How could it look like? And how do we begin to see through and beyond our intersecting planetary crisis? So this topic relates quite a lot to our section, or to the first section in our exhibition, the starting to observe the critical zone observatory space by the architects Alexandra Aren and Sohel Hajmirbaba, which is basically an outdoor laboratory which is transferred within an architectural model into the light yard of the ZKM. And on-site in Strengbach in France, scientists measure and monitor different data from the quality of the water and how nutrients exchange in the soil to the development of the forest. So my guests for tonight, they have a bit of a different approach. We have a very exciting format. It is between like performative reading, lecture, presentation, and at the end, we will have a small Q&A session. And this episode will sketch and prefigure alternative visions for observing and caring for what Sam Skinner and Mirko Nikolić call material communities. So based on their interdependent and collaborative research and praxis, it will connect an artist-led horticulture project in Oxford and the river basin of Korenita and Jadar in the Balkans. The riversides are under threat of old and new large-scale extractivist operations. The above drawn out questions, or the questions they will tackle actually, are unravelled and entangled from the positions of regenerative practices of horticulture and de-extractivist poetry. Let me give you a quick introduction of both of them. Sam Skinner is an artist, curator, and publisher working on intersections between community, technology, and horticulture. He completed a practice-based PhD at Manchester School of Art in 2019, which investigated the history of observatories and observation, with research translating into co-curation of the new observatory exhibition at FACT Liverpool and the artist's book OBS, published by Broken Dimanche Press. He has recently launched a new art and horticulture project entitled FIG, but he will tell you more about it later on. Mirko Nikolić is an artist and researcher. His practice seeks to contribute to climate and earth justice through performance and text. His current long-term project, Water is Non-Life, based at Linköping University, moves in a space between art and environmental humanities. It deals with entanglements between climate and social justice in the regions of intense extractivist exploitation in the semispheres of Europe. He compiled a PhD at the Center of Research, Education and Arts and Media at the University of Westminster, London in 2017, with a project titled Minoritarian Ecologies, Performance, before a more than human world. And I think with that, I'll hand over the word to Sam and Mirko. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everybody out there. Thanks a lot for coming along. I'm going to talk and kind of paint a picture of the different lines that observation treads. Peter, I think if we can just have one of the slides. Thanks. And to put it crudely, on the one hand, a tool of extraction, on the other, a tool of care. And later I will hand over to Mirko, and then we'll also speak together, and we're going to have some videos and exercises throughout. So I'm interested, I suppose, in this talk in exploring how even in the throes of climate change, when we undoubtedly need to engage deeply with rationalist big science and every fraction of a degree matters, what other modes of observation, participation and commoning may be fruitful to remember and invent? And how might different modes cross-fertilize and speak to one another? The talk is intended to relate to the broader context of critical zones and function in conversation with Mirko's work and presentation. I will show slides from an artist's book entitled OBS, a co-curated exhibition entitled The New Observatory, and finally an art and horticulture project entitled FIG. But I'm actually not going to refer to them explicitly, but maybe we can do that in the chat. This is partly due to time, but also this approach illustrates a slightly more tangential mode that I'm interested in. And these slides also tell a story of my transition from collaboratively growing a temporary observatory run by artists toward the establishment of what is essentially a community garden run by artists, dragonflies, gladioli, rain, earth, bugs, etc. And implicit in this speculation is, and to put it in kind of ecological terms, that there is perhaps an excess and growing normativity of representation and measurement occurring. And I'm interested in exploring how we might shift towards working and observing at one-to-one scale, observing by doing in more participatory commoning ways that rely less upon conventional translation acts and conventional forms of evidence and observation. And interspersed throughout will be a series of what Mirko and I call posters. They're 1 minute videos, and they're a kind of a space for rest and to pause and to listen, and maybe some collective conversation in the Telegram chat. So I hand over to Mirko.
Good Abend, good evening, everyone. Very nice to be here, even remotely in the critical zones and Terrestrial University. So I will now just briefly ground how we meet, because that's important as well. So one of the starting points of our collaboration, or rather ongoing shared conversation, to say it with Donna Haraway, has been riverine agency. In particular, we've met quite a few times around the River Thames, along which we held a workshop titled Curating the Material Community as part of the New Materialisms Training School at Tate Modern in 2016. And the other point of meeting has for us been actual field of new materialism, in particular the kind of larger constellation ecosystem, fantastic universe of the then ongoing European big research project, cost action on new materialism, networking European scholarship on how matter comes to matter, and among other Among different events, we also had a session at the 9th annual conference on the new materialisms held at Utrecht University, and that was titled Common in Communities and Hyper-Rural Urbanity. So out of these exchanges, slowly and patiently emerged a jointly written article, Community, titled Community, which was part of a special issue of on new materialisms. And so we're both practitioners, as Sam said, in various fields and coming from various different backgrounds and modes of engagement, but we have been co-writing and sharing so for a while now, and you will see somehow the most recent year, more or less, of our exchanges. What I will specifically talk about today is a piece of post-disciplinary research, which is mainly rooted and it flows from my current postdoc project titled Water is Life, Non-Life, De-extractivist Poetics in the Semi-Periphery, hosted at the Institute for Culture and Society at Linköping University in Sweden. And as part of that, I will invite you to join me in reproductive labor in a geography that takes place space and time at the confluence of rivers Sava and Danube in the Balkans. And from that geography and history, I will discuss, put forth some observations, impressions, expressions, affects of how it feels and sounds and touches like to be at this intense intersection of climate and environmental justice in one of the frontiers of extraction in Europe at the moment, which is Southeast Europe or the Balkans. So I'll hand back to Sam.
Thank you, Mirko. So, when observation becomes form, imagine the observatory upside down as a writing instrument, not of humans, but of the earth. Reading and writing news of change. Imagine it exploded, decentered everywhere. Once instruments were contained in buildings, observations contained in hidden notebooks, or perhaps sent on horseback to a small community of observers. Now the instruments and the data are outmoded, changed, or have left the building. Out at sea, in your pocket, in the desert, into orbit, like how the crust of the earth has moved into the sky. Has the world become an observatory? Have we become observatories? A world wrapped in instruments, collisions and cascades of debris, and increasing interoperability. Observation, a value or inscription ascribed to phenomena, which becomes phenomena, which in turn has a form ascribed to it, which becomes phenomena, which in turn has a form ascribed to it, which becomes phenomena, etc. The turn to turning. What happens in the betweening, joining, remixing, folding, inserts, readings, margins of these processes? Ascribing and inscribing into, out of matter. Observation feeds taxonomy, which powers extraction and colonization, fundamentally altering the constitution of the worlds. Bertrand Russell wrote, work is of two kinds. First, altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface relatively to other such matter. Second, telling other people to do so. Observation, too, is moving something from one place to another, from one thing to another, simultaneously through physical and philosophical substantiation. Observation displays, represents, and demonstrates to differing degrees. Perhaps the observatory and observation is like a heart, electrifying, oxygenating, regulating, pumping data, substances, matter, spirit, to other parts, into other things, to parts known and unknown. So we're now going to have the first of the poster exercises. A short video for 1 minute. So if you want to get onto the Telegram and just listen, in my section, there'll be some of the texts a little bit more within the video itself. So yeah, if you can play that, please, Peter. Observations acting like mitochondria that power the observatory condition, the observatory condition. More observations. More observations that power and variously distill and add noise to the system. Perhaps observations funnel phenomena into politics, into social change. Policy guided by the weather, like an Aeolian harp played by the wind. Spirit borrows from matter the perceptions on which it feeds and restores them to matter in the form of movements which it has stamped with its own freedom, Bergson wrote. In the act of observation of the real, what occurs? Michel Serres writes, modernity begins when this real world space is taken as a scene, and this scene, controlled by the director, turns inside out. Or, as Raymond Royer wrote, and I'm grateful to Bruno Latour's citing of this, everything real possesses itself. The real possesses itself. And so what is produced in this encounter between the real that possesses itself, an observation that possesses itself too, a visualization of sound, a number for heat, a refraction of light. But what are these? Translations, transductions? As Walter Benjamin articulates so well, translatability varies. Observation and its inscriptions are products of betweenness and contradiction. But produce what? A modality of reciprocal difference, never coinciding with itself, with the thing, which was never a thing in the first place. Boundaries falsify the observation, that solid results are appreciated, usable, workable, its limits, its affordance, a measure of measure, a loving modularity. So now into the second video. interaction, a strange encounter. And in the cloud of unknowing, observation is more experimental than it likes to let on, perhaps. As Hans-Jörg Reinberger has written, an experimental system is a system of manipulation designed to give unknown answers to questions that the experimenters themselves are not yet able to clearly ask. The spirit of the observational and its sister, the experimental, is simultaneously reductive and generative, materializing unforeseen answers, questions, and crucially, acts. Often kind of mad and beautiful and horrifying all at once. Consider these words of the all at once polymath, scientist, priest, philosopher, theologian, historian, William Whewell. You have no idea the variety of different uses to which I shall turn a mountain. After perhaps sketching it from the bottom, I shall climb to the top and measure its height by barometer, knocking off a piece of rock with a geological hammer to see what it is made of, and then evolve some quotation from Wordsworth into the still air above it. Here, the earliest scene for observing and extracting is played out, moving from one place to another, from one thing to another, but note the poetic, romantic dimension that catalyzes a connection to the air above. Today, observing instruments seem to grow and divide like plants. The perfect conditions: water, air, sunlight, nutrients, capitalism, colonialism, extraction, climate change. Easier to think of more instruments than a climate for change, perhaps. But when we observe the crisis in such detail, surely we will find a way, a will. The data will reprogram us. We are more like computers than we think, perhaps. An observation today speaks in the language of science, our new true Esperanto. To speak and observe beyond singular subject-object relations, a connected body of people observing every fraction of a degree is a powerful currency and connective tissue indeed. We are all in this together, a collective of participant observers of the condemned and the compossible. 6 billion children of the crash of science into everyday life. Once specialized instruments and modes of thought now becoming ever more everyday. And here I'm talking about the observational, not even the other little techno-scientific actions like combustion that we do every day on a massive scale that define us. But will the observational paradigm evolve and change or just spread? Science isn't the only way to move beyond singular subject-object relations. And when it's defined by the separation of nature and culture, alternatives are a requisite. As Simon Schaefer has written, technologies such as the telescope had simultaneously to be the unambiguous property of their masters, yet the lessons must be accounts of nature's properties. This is the observational paradigm of today. I observed this. How might we move from an observational culture of I and this to we and with, differently in unity, perhaps? We live in a collage of observational representation and the real, phenomena hybridizing with noumena, material with semiotics, slowly merging with each passing day, each new IPCC report and each new wildfire. Beyond science, the earth is performing a kind of wild pedagogy, teaching us about the world, about how untamable it is, about the free-flowing liquidity of its agency, and what happens when its wildness is disrupted. Nature now offers its own narrative and frames the human species, placing it within the scale and register of Earth system science, Claire Colbert writes. Or, as Jennifer Gabrice describes, networked environmental sensors make it possible to listen in on a planet that has always been talking to us, but which we can only now begin to hear. But lest we forget that we have sensors within ourselves and that listening to the Earth has been a practice of indigenous cultures for millennia. New instruments catalyze both novel and normative forms of observation. As the world is ever more made to measure, tamed, customized, quantified, and made consistent with instruments and observation, we have to use different forms of observation that do not fit the mold, are less embedded with histories of extraction, the squares, rules, compasses, and dividers that have served colonization all too well. We need to acknowledge how observation is a pharmacon, both poison and remedy, a fundament of extraction, colonizing, taxonomy, rule. But it is also a kind of touchstone for gathering, of tracing and facing up to the parts per million, the degrees C, the alternatives. How might we develop more wild, embodied observational skills that variously challenge, alter, and hybridize with technological instruments of observation beyond the normative? How might we develop more wild, akin to Max Ernst's preference for having one eye looking in and one eye looking out? Might we draw upon earlier forms of observation that were both poetic and rational, such as the Naturphilosophie associated with German idealism, which, as Hankins and Silverman write, catalyzed the emergence of concepts such as energy, the magnetic field, cell theory, and evolution, inconceivable in the unromantic Enlightenment. Or observation linked to natural magic that engaged with matters of wonder, not simply matters of fact, and the occult that affirms that the real cannot be observed directly, rather that only by analogy can we observe indirectly. A romantic view of human in nature, not observing nature, less objective, less separate, but closer to nature, with and among nature. Not to deny normative scientific observation, but mediate between the very old and the very new, instrument and body, object and observer, that, like Carrie Wolf said of post-humanism, is not simply being about after humanism, but being before and after humanism. Not Gramsci's morbid interregnum of the old suppressing the new, but flowing observational andness and the always already. How to make the earth more fertile, the air less polluted, biodiversity thrive. Looking for unconformity, evidence of change in perpetuity, compassion even, a re-invocation of agency, of multiple beings in invitation to variation, forever in correspondence. And we'll now just go to the third. I think I'm running over slightly, so I'm not going to do this final reading. But for anyone who's really keen, they can go back to the recording maybe and pause it or buy the book. This is the OBS book from Broken Democracy Press. I'll say the last line I was going to say, which was make the world matter. So over to you, Mirko.
Water is life, no life. Voda je život, ne život. So I'll take you along into a performance and the geography and the history in the making. And it's a segment of larger workings, but you will see some images from a piece that took place at the Museum of Contemporary Art Belgrade in fall last year, and it continues next week and beyond. And in this piece, I wade into the conjunction of two rivers, Sava and Danube, Donau, and I wade into confluence of times to continue with labors of social reproduction. And some few hundred kilometers upstream from that place, landed citizens have suffered a major antimony tailing spill started by the catastrophic floods that hit the Balkans in May 2014. On that occasion, the poorly regulated tailings spilled into these waters and left a long trail in the soil, the water, the animals. Since 2003, another so-called critical mineral is in the target, while fumes and leaks from a toxic lead smelter in the neighboring village, both remediated finally and hopefully, but now troubled by a massive lithium mining, processing, disposing projects. And so I listened to voices from downstream, where two rivers join from a massive copper-gold mining district, state-run for almost 70 years, now majority private. Neither the state nor the company are taking responsibility for the smoke for the rivers mixed with tailings. And there are more leaky mines and more mining projects in these lands. These mountains, these river basins. The waters in and around the city at the confluence itself are threatened by predatory real estate developments. And before and beyond these zones of impact, aquatic arts of reproduction of life, plant and animal communities take place all along its winding route. So the following flow is a continuous shared conversation with, on the one hand, Karen Barad's queer posthumanist rendering of quantum entanglement, and as many colleagues, I'm trying to tease and situate some of its implications for social theory and practice and arts and humanities. And on the other, I'm speaking with the tradition of feminist materialism, in particular the feminist standpoint theory and theory of social reproduction and social practice. And related to these lines of inquiry with queer feminist ecology and environmental humanities. How can you, I, she, they, it observe a river basin, even a single river? By soaking into its histories in the making, by following its banks, riverine communities, its bottom, its surfaces, listening to various voices, hearing the noises, but unlistening to extraction empires. Observatory participating waters on the outside and on the inside with Astrida Neymanis' hydrofeminism. Getting to know the social, from the fresh spring to the tailings dam and beyond. Waters carry toxins or oxygen or both. Droplets are not indifferent to what they carry. Rivers of droplets of participating feelings, responsive to the gift of the waters arriving, responsible for what passes further on, in gathering many other waters, from the spring all the way down towards the Black Sea and further on. Material community in movement. But where and when does the observation start? When I board the train, when I'm in the field, or when I'm in the village, meeting community members, animals and plants, or when I introduce myself, or when I press record, or when I refrain from pressing record button, or touching the shoot button on the camera, or, and. Where, when, where, will, are, space, time matters, of hers, their stories, of co-making, make history from the bottom. And now I invite you again to a 1-minute poster exercise, some time to pause, reflect, listen, or converse on the Telegram channel. Poster 4, her, their, our stories. Going there and immersing oneself, which somewhat always redraws the modernist lines, even in so many other ways. So how do we do when one is always already part of the field? Before the click, there is plenty involvement, complicitous, challenging, resisting, alternative making. The depth of one's involvement is specific and situated, part of much deeper collectivized but unequal wadings. So here I set out briefly and insufficiently some account of my involvements, direct and indirect, known to me and obscured from me, with the extractivist apparatus, at least since 2014. Our information communication technology devices take us to so many places that the World Wide Web does not, or it does, but inadequately and insufficiently. Industrial society and its preferred technologies are borne out by violent means and often perpetuated throughout their cycles. Where can these cycles be reversed? To counter this, critical and community arts researchers, activists, rather than turning one's back or accepting the neat black boxes of extractivism, we witness violence. But witness for whom? Stories by whom and for whom? And then, what do we do when we observe injustice? Can we observe injustice without acting? When is observation amounting to tacit or not so tacit participation? There are also different types of violence executed by the extractivist apparatus and the supporting state authorities, overt and covert. In the cities, overdeveloped and underdeveloped and export zones, cutting channels between many face Earth, now compressed flat. Millions, billions of eyes and fingers stare, click, touch, depose their knowledges, their feelings straight into endless servers. Echoing Langston Hughes's Johannesburg mines, what kind of poem would you or I make of that? Human knowings and feelings carved into chips of sand and mineral, fenced and financialized for dreams of accumulation and control. Light violences of everyday extraction. In the classrooms, in the woods, in the workshops, in the mires, in the museums, in the streams. No, she, you, I are not mercenaries of next level appropriators, apportioners of knowledge, art, labor. Smells, tastes, affects cannot be stripped from their warm soils, without consent, without consequence. Fair and just, free, prior, informed consent. But these are near to impossible to give or receive in extraction zones. Realities of privatization and enclosure already violated. In extraction zones, it is empire who observes, surveys, and gathers data. If the news of this type traveled, the world would be organized quite differently. The world of computers would not be nearly as violent. To witness extractivism without extracting any further, not to take anyone, anything away, and not to repeat the pattern, systemically withdrawing from taking pictures, shooting images, recording news, making databases, however secure and consensual. It seems more benign just to take the story rather than a lump of earth. May we pause with each click, each shot? Representation should be for a good cause, but is it a common cause? Now we move into another 1 minute poster exercise, some time to pause, reflect and listen with poster 5, measure, sense, think. To observe, participate, in the sense of witnessing yet uncooperating with extractivism, to grasp the depth of the apparatus which is beyond the human and cannot be comprehended singularly, partially because of the hydra-like ramifications of the apparatus of the powerful, the infrastructures, the geographies, the actors, and also because significant parts of this knowledge are with great effort hidden away from public access. Industrial secrets, diplomatic meetings, business agreements. Some of these can be accessed by legal techniques and through privilege. For example, a distinguished professor at a distinguished university or a semi-precarious postdoc researcher at a university. But the point being, these tools are not available to those directly impacted. They can get help from artists, academics, NGOs, and so forth, but on the long run, how does this shift power and knowledge relations? Unworking, reworking the conditions of participation. Collective, collaborative work of participating, observing. Of matter, discourse, power. How much can possibly mine, or yours, or ours, or any relatively small collective take in and sustain, feel, or understand? While on the slopes of and in the coasts of the magically repainted green, responsible, clean miners conjure to wash techno-capitalism from the stains of coal and oil, greenwash with sedimented clays, with wisdom of ancient beds. What kind of poem, paper, film can you or I make of that? In the zone of so-called spatial plan for special purpose of exploitation of Jadarit, in the face of the Red River's looming plunder, you crochet ever so patiently, congregations between river and valley inhabitants, in villages and hills, you laugh together about how many crops can a lithium-ion battery bring into fruit. In the villages of people, bees, beech, sheep, hawks, magpies share sweat and breath. In these villages, honey is worth more than lithium. Plums are sweeter than borates. Food powers inside and outside, rebirth and regenerates. Earth others observe and participate. Participatingly observe through them ourselves. Another commoner among the many, one is a droplet in the river, sensing, participating, as yet another citizen, aerobio, geo, aquatarian, disinvesting, privilege of access, and turning towards unlikely, forbidden, extraordinary friendships across the hemispheres of extraction. 1 minute poster exercise follows here, and it is poster 6, friendships.
So we're going to finish with a kind of a short collective reading, and then one final video. Commoning.
Before and after the enclosures, before and after the dams, pits, holes, clear cuts, listening to Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, the surround listens and touches.
Observation as celebration. You are not me, I sense you, yet we are tied up in attention.
Killjoys, troublemakers, water protectors, workers of commons, of social reproduction of earth, sensors, thinkers with Arturo Escobar, co-figuring the surround which is in between.
How do these collective actions focalize into a common observatory, a body of work?
Working body to reconstruct in common as a part of life-sustaining practices, ecologically, psychologically, relationally, socially.
Institutions, institution.
Always already.
Now, before, after.
Labors.
Moving something, matter, from one place to another.
One.
To.
Another.
To.
Another.
To.
Another.
From one to.
Another. From.
One to another.
From.
One to.
Another. From.
No one without the other.
Earthwork.
Earthwork studio.
Earth-sea studio.
Earth-sea.
Common sea. Common waters.
Plot.
Basin. Coming together.
Sustaining circle.
Waiting for a flood. Inside the basin. Basin within basin. Inside the center. Inside the measurement. Modeling the past-future limnologies.
Models of models of models of models, slicing speech acts and representation in extra states of mimicry into pieces of action and carefully modelled and operationalised Earth pie.
The other way to look has been, is to listen.
Spreadsheeting, itemising, weighing, cutting, cooking, selling, making.
Mushrooming, grooming, manure maneuvers, playing waters, drawing in the mud.
Becoming unstuck.
The world, the image, to measure. Like food.
Meandering.
Through the body.
Literal zones of
transitions of observation.
Receiving.
Conducting.
Receptacle.
Giving.
Only for a while.
Transit orienting.
Streaming up.
Streaming down.
Effort.
Ease.
Entry.
Enclosure.
Hanging on to these shores.
Again, a measure.
For measure, for measure, for measure.
For measure, for measure. Have you, I, we, them been liquid?
Before and before. Construct an image of observation that seeds its own dissolve.
Weave a picture that unravels itself. A commons with, is it ourself among we?
Commoning is
A co.
Sam and Mirko, thank you so much for this very inspiring poetic reading. I'm still trying to process everything in my mind because there were so many lovely references to Donna Haraway, to Anat Singh with the mushrooming. Thanks for that, really. I think my favorite part was probably when Sam was saying perhaps the observatory and observation is like a heart, electrifying, oxygenating, regulating, difficult word, pumping data, substances, matter, spirit to other parts, into other things, to parts known and unknown. That was what really stuck with me up until now. And I also like very much the pictures, Mirko, that you had on site there. So I think we have a couple of minutes time now to talk and to discuss. And I will just quickly check in the Telegram channel if we got some questions. We don't have questions from the audience, but I have some questions to you. Maybe the first one goes to Sam. So you talked about your fig project and you showed us some pictures of the growing side. And I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit more about the project just recently, I think, Elder Vernacular.
Yeah. So yeah, there's two projects that I'm working on. JC Niala's 1918 allotment, where we're basically trying to recreate an allotment from 1918 as a way in for JC to think about Spanish flu from 1918 onwards, First World War, and kind of use the growing site. So what FIG offers is it has these two growing sites to artists. So that was JC's idea that she's been developing. We've been doing readings there. And then Elder Vernacular really came from an idea of how could we grow materials on a site. And Eleanor Greenhouse, that I'm working on that project with, has really kind of taken it further and is thinking about the 1 mile radius around the site and building a kind of palette of materials. And so some of the pictures you saw included an archaeological dig where she's going down and finding clay to be used for casting, but then crucially, she's putting it back into the ground. And I suppose it's a kind of bit of a critique of extractivist practices and in the arts, and kind of taking very seriously the materials that are used. And where that's going is she's working on with a few different groups making things out of some of the materials that have been growing. She's been foraging and to produce a kind of artistic compost heap. And so again, it's about how can we put things back into the ground? How can we improve, the soil? Which I suppose is this sort of big counter, to the image that Mirko's been working with of, just kind of extraction and kind of, pollution and other things. Yeah, and I just say at the end of the OBS book, the narrative within that is that the observatory turns into a kind of a garden, and the observatory turns into a windmill, and some of these, obviously there's lots of observation happening when you're growing plants, but in this kind of hybrid way with technology and the body and different organisms, that I was kind of thinking about a little bit in the talk.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this question of can we observe without action, and when does it turn into participation? That's exactly like this project is an exemplary thing of exactly these things. Observing, participating, just like the title that you set. Mirko, maybe coming back to your works on site in Serbia, the two places you talked about. Maybe you tell us a bit more how this community work there is structured, or who are the people? Who are they? Who are the people you were working with on site there?
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So I suppose there are different communities, or different parts of community, and also actually geographically displaced. So in a way, different places. I mean, so that's what I tried to convey as well. That what we saw is one bit, but that's like in the middle somewhat, because there is another area upstream and another downstream, and there are so many others, of course, upstream and downstream. So it is this kind of being in the middle, and how does one face both ways, I suppose. So because in a way, in a linear kind of, industrialist perspective, if like there is a point of discharge of a factory or tailings dam, of course, engineering wise, and just it seems obvious that we're looking just downstream and the consequences and so on, the impacts, but actually the impacts travel also in so many different ways to the social as well, and well beyond these specific communities, which are the frontline communities. So I think it's kind of been growing also in different geographies, this work, but it's really about kind of tracing this like sense, which is like a bit pulling from the quantum, these barrades, quantum interpretation, that actually of course, like each act of observation is doing doing something. And we've known this also from, critical debates, in art and media as well. There's there's lots of discussion on that. However, I'm also interested in this aspect that actually when one works with, let's say, specifically metals, one is already within whatever one does, more or less. So one is inside this also apparatus that one is observing from before one even starts observing, so to say. So yeah, it's kind of then retracing always these impacts, and then hopefully somehow through art and culture here, sharing them actually, because it is now with the kind of moment of climate breakdown, ecological crises, and so on, as the kind of the backdrop of this. A bit Sam has actually put it is, as you know, that most of the solutions, so to say, or at least on the kind of big scale as they're being proposed, are more or less about shifting the impacts. We move it from this place to another, and then sacrifice zones are being recreated. So instead, climate justice effectively means sharing the burden, and there are many burdens. So and joys in all this, of course, because actually when one starts tracing these impacts, one actually makes friends, hopefully, because that's the point. Like somehow that kind of the current infrastructures and of course the organization of labor tends to make this next to impossible. It's very hard to be a friend with someone who is manufacturing these devices, but actually that's part of this retracing and going back and so forth, participating, observing. So yeah, and climate justice is about sharing the burden, resharing, redistributing the burdens as such, because they are physical, really psychological, and also they extend, of course, in all these aspects, mentally, bodily, discursively, also well beyond the human as well. So how do we share this somehow in a more just way, I suppose?
That's a very interesting thought, and it brings it to the point, like sharing the burden. Well, I'm wondering how will the project proceed? Where do you want to take it, or within the next years? Do you have something in your mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is lots of tracing, so to say, and a lots of places. But yeah, I mean, it is really about finding, I think, constantly in a way, re-experimenting with what, how, and where, and when actually one listens, let's say observes, or witnesses, and then also where and when and how and why. One, here I'm singling myself, but it's always much larger somehow community of people. When does one actually speak up or say? And this is something I think that there is not a solution to it, but it's always reworking somehow. I don't want to call it specifically methodology, because it is ethical politics, but yeah, it is somehow about resituating oneself. And also I think that's also the dynamics, that the one part of it seems to be it's just localized in different ways. There is commitments and relationships and friendships that one develops in specific geographies, but also how does one bring this home? That's something I'm somehow mostly interested in, especially maybe now with these 2 years it's become pandemic, it's become more obvious somewhat, but anyways, it's always been like that. It's the kind of the insight, the feminist insight, that the home is the site of social reproduction, the site of violence, but also the site of liberation. So yeah, how do we do this at home?
Yeah, and resituating is a good point, which tackles also the thoughts of Bruno Latour, and how do we want to create a future that is livable? How do we want to live together? All these are very, very important points. Thank you for your answer. I think we slowly have to get to an end at this point because time is running. But Sam, Mirko, do you have anything that you would like to give to the audience at the end?
Well, just to follow on from that point, I think if you accept the kind of partiality of observation, that you can't see everything, which actually, you know, I think Bruno Latour, his work talks about, you know, about that, you know, a critique of observation and its limits or its constructive nature. But at the same time, you know, we know that there are very real things, you know, which I was talking about, you know, the 2 degrees C. But also if we accept that partiality and we actually embrace what all other organisms and beings can observe themselves, and we work together in a kind of web, I think that's where a really kind of exciting space for observation emerges, you know, and that's following on from, you know, what Mirko said, that if we kind of take on these limits, these affordances, these challenges, these battles, you know, these friendships, you know, within that kind of creating that kind of web, I think is an interesting, you know, place to be. And yeah, and I'd just add, you know, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this. I've got the 500-page catalogue, which I've been working through, and I think it's such an exciting project, and has been really rich to engage with.
Yeah, that's really nice to hear. Thank you for being with us. I have your publication as well, and I have to find some time to read it, actually. I just had a sneak peek into it. Thank you, Mirko. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks.
It was really nice to be able to talk to you. And we have, unfortunately, almost reached the end of this whole experimental lecture series of the Terrestrial University. This was the second last episode. We have another one just about, I think, next Thursday with the artist Raza, who has an installation in the Critical Zones exhibition called Atmospheric Forest, and she's talking to a couple of other scientists she's worked with in the Finnwald in Switzerland. So I'm looking forward to that. And I think with that, I'll let you all go into your well-deserved evening. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks to the whole team.
Bye-bye. Oh, yeah, thank you. Before I forget it, thanks very much to Peter from the video studio. Yes. Thank you to our press and communications team, and thanks to Tatiana for taking care of the chat. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.